Hydrilla was introduced into the United States in Florida in the late 1950s. Basically through the 1960s it stayed in canals, areas like that. Didn't get into our large lakes until about the 1980s. So we've had not a super long history with hydrilla in the state of Florida, even though it's been here since the 1950s. So I guess the premise of the talk is more, does hydrilla function like a native plant with enhanced growth properties, or do the invasive characteristics of hydrilla result in a significant change in ecosystem function? And that's really a tough topic in terms of, hydrilla grows really fast, and I think we all know that. It can be used in some ways for habitat enhancement, but it can also get out of control pretty quickly, and we've seen that in a lot of our large lakes in Florida. Now, I wanted to start with something a little less controversial, where maybe we can agree on something in terms of aquatic plant managers and people that are more interested in fish and wildlife interest, and that's the need to manage floating plants. And while there is some debate there about managing floating plants and whether we should or shouldn't, the one thing we can say about floating plants is they can be habitat destroyers. You can take a nice scene like this, move a water hyacinth or a water lettuce in there, and in a very short period of time result in a complete alteration of that habitat. So from the standpoint of managing floating plants, I think we tend to be in general agreement that that's needed. A scene like this with water lettuce just permeating bulrush, lotus, focus of my research here lately has been, how do you remove the water lettuce without leaving a large footprint with the other species? And really that whole issue of selectivity, and can we do a better job of targeting the invasives? And again, that's been a focus of research. There tends to be a lot less agreement when we talk about hydrilla, when you talk about fish and wildlife interests, and what is the role of hydrilla in the system? There's a lot of people that would say this is nothing more than habitat enhancement. You've created more habitat with the hydrilla edge along a bulrush nufar line. And I think that's really been a debate that's been going on since the 1970s in the state of Florida. Is hydrilla enhancing habitat, or do we need to be more aggressive about managing it? Now, it's certainly perceived as increasing habitat. There's several that would say it improves habitat. So we know it can grow 10-pound bass, and that's a fact. That you read on the internet. It's there's 10-pound bass in every hydrilla bed. I ask the question a lot of times, why aren't there 30-pound ringnecks in every hydrilla bed? So from the standpoint of kind of the lay opinion on the value of hydrilla, then we'll deal with some of the fish and wildlife scientists on the value of hydrilla, and there's some pretty strong opinions there. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there's not good fish in hydrilla. There are. I'm not going to tell you that ringneck ducks don't love hydrilla. They do. I mean, it's anyone that's been out knows it. The question becomes, how much hydrilla do we want to let grow on some of our natural systems? And do we really have control of it at some point? And that's really what I want to focus this talk on, is, at what point as a manager do we start getting concerned when we let hydrilla go? Now, from the science side of things, there's certainly publications out there that will say hydrilla provides ecosystem services. And that's, here in Florida, Mark Hoyer and Dan Canfield's group, a fairly recent publication basically saying that, hydrilla didn't really have any net negative impact on birds, fish, other wildlife. Nancy Rubicki and her group on the Potomac River, I mean, they really are using hydrilla up there. And they're not, when I say using, by non-management, they're allowing hydrilla to grow in the Potomac River area and the Chesapeake Bay area. Basically saying that is creating habitat that wasn't there, and that is attracting fish and birds. I think the one thing they have going for them in the Chesapeake is the issue of salinity that Steve talked about. Salinity really controls where hydrilla will grow in the Chesapeake Bay, and hydrilla does not like much salinity. So there are pockets of hydrilla that will grow in the freshwater areas, but we know it's not going to expand into the bay at large. One thing I find really interesting is if you want to know about hydrilla growth, look at the literature from China. Okay, and the Chinese are really prolific right now about working with hydrilla. And at first, my mind is geared towards management. I'm thinking, well, why are the Chinese trying to control hydrilla? You know, it must have gotten bad all of a sudden. The Chinese are trying to grow hydrilla. And the reason is their systems are so degraded, it's one of the few plants they can actually get to grow in a lot of their polluted systems. So a lot of their work is dealing with toxic waste uptake, you know, super high nutrient systems, that type of thing. So I do find that kind of ironic that I get a call for an email from China every now and then, you know, how do you grow it better? You know, and I'm, well, I can tell you how to kill it, and I can probably tell you how to grow it better, but I don't know that that's always the best thing. Now, you know, I think in a lot of cases as aquatic plant managers, we've been maybe accused by some of having fairly closed minds when it comes to, you know, invasive plants, that we're just going to go after them. You know, and I can say at least within our professional society, the Aquatic Plant Management Society, we did organize in 2011. It was an entire morning session to provide some very different perspectives on the role of hydrilla, you know, and its potential for providing ecosystem services, and brought in several speakers, much like myself, who were probably not favored during a particular session. And they told us as managers why they saw hydrilla as a real benefit to various systems. And I think that, you know, those types of dialogues are good. And, you know, again, you know, to me, it's just basically as managers, I think we do need to keep open minds on those types of things. So I guess kind of to start with all that background, you know, what is the long-term presence of hydrilla meant in Florida? And, you know, I guess the key question to me is, hydrilla provide critical fish and wildlife habitat? You know, we know it provides habitat. There's just no doubt in my mind that, you know, if you've been out on the lakes, you've seen it. And if so, what's the right amount? And that's probably the key from a manager standpoint. You know, what is the right amount? You have to balance as a manager fish and wildlife concerns with other stakeholders. You know, the other stakeholders, you know, outside of fish and wildlife interest, I would say there's not many stakeholders that want to see a lot of hydrilla. And, you know, that includes pleasure boaters, homeowners, you know, those types of folks. So one thing we've also seen with hydrilla is that, you know, allowing it to maintain or sustain in a system is going to ensure further spread. So, you know, at least when we go up north and talk about hydrilla, we really try to, you know, tell them, you know, you need to get on top of hydrilla and not let it get established in a state like New York or Michigan, you know, because we've got plenty of native plants up there and we don't want to see hydrilla spread. We've got to recognize that both the plant itself, hydrilla, as well as the management that we do can have negative impacts, and we've seen that in various forms through the years. And then I think, you know, the big key to me is acceptable control is one of those things. We need to agree on it up front, and that's where I think this group comes in, and you've certainly had some members that have been fairly vocal in terms of trying to get in on the front end and talk about hydrilla management plans and you know, what you want to see, and that's certainly important for the stakeholders to, you know, get in on the front end and let's agree up front what acceptable control should look like. Why do we manage it? I mean, you know, when you really get down to it, it provides food and structure. When it's at low density, it's really considered, you know, by a lot of people to be very prime habitat. Doesn't produce toxins. I mean, there's nothing about the plant itself that, you know, even though it is invasive, that would be considered harmful in any way to wildlife or fish. You know, certainly valued by sportsmen. That's why I'm here talking to you. You know, I think the real reason we manage it is that it's got a growth rate that is very different than anything we experience with our native submerged vegetation. And it's the ability to occupy these very vast expanses. And again, we don't have a history on a lot of our lakes of having vast open water coverage of submerged aquatic vegetation. When hydrilla came in, it basically altered that dynamic, and it could spread very rapidly across these systems. Now, done right, we feel as managers that hydrilla management can be done in a manner to promote native vegetation. So in a lot of these systems where you've got Vallisneria, Naiad, those types of plants, that if we do it right, we should replace a lot of the littoral hydrilla with the natives. We're not going to replace open water hydrilla with natives because natives never really grew there in the first place. So, this idea of controlling hydrilla in open water and replacing it with natives is we just haven't seen it happen yet. Okay, so to understand hydrilla, we need to understand the biology. So this is the Hydrilla 101 portion of the talk that Joe asked me to kind of speak about. And I think one of the real keys is we perceive coverage. So we can go out to any system at any time. We can see a scene like this, and we really don't think about how did it get there? How did it get this way? This was actually, I think, a late November shot. So hydrilla can stay on the surface, essentially through the winter in Florida. Provides the cover that I think you guys value as waterfowl hunters. But, I guess we don't really think about, how did the system go from an introduction to that widespread of coverage? So it's certainly been called the almost perfect weed. And there's a lot of features of, physiological features of hydrilla that really allow it to I don't even want to call it outcompete natives because the natives aren't growing in the open water. But that ability to cover thousands of contiguous acres of larger systems, there is a reason that hydrilla can do that. And that really relates back to some of the, it's got low light and carbon dioxide compensation points. So before any of our native plants can use the light or the CO2 that's available, hydrilla's got mechanisms that allows it to utilize those and basically scavenge those from the water. It's one of the only, propagates by fragments, tubers, turions, no seed production. So you'll see flowers on hydrilla, but it's basically what we have in Florida is an all-female population. So there's no sexual reproduction that goes on in Florida. So everything that in terms of growth of hydrilla has occurred, due to clonal growth. Okay, I mentioned the low light and CO2 compensation points, and light quality is a real interesting thing. Is that when the hydrilla is down in the water column, you've got low light, you've got different light quality. It stimulates the plant to elongate very rapidly. Okay, so it's shooting straight to the surface. That's its strategy, is to get to the surface as quickly as possible. Once it gets towards the surface, the light quality changes and it's stimulated to branch very prolifically. Okay, so we don't have any native plant analog like that, that its life strategy is to bolt to the surface and then form a dense canopy at the surface. And I think that's one of the reasons that hydrilla has been so successful here. You've got nice shallow water in Florida, pretty nice warm conditions, and a plant that has a strategy to canopy in these shallow waters. So, as I mentioned, there's at least, not to say that native plants can't get to the surface in the United States, but there's no native submerged vegetation in the United States that actually its life strategy is to form a canopy. There's 3 invasives that do: hydrilla, Eurasian water milfoil, and curly-leaf pondweed. All show this tendency to want to bolt to the surface and then form dense canopies. And that's basically why those 3 are probably our biggest 3 submerged weeds in the United States, is that they're basically doing something that none of our natives have done. The other neat thing about the hydrilla canopy, and again, pretty solid, this is I think 9-10 feet of water that we're in. Temperatures in that canopy can exceed 40 degrees C. Your DO, during the day, it gets super saturated, so it can be upwards of 15 parts per million right in that upper canopy. Then it will drop very rapidly at night. Your pH can swing 4 or 5 units. So if you think about that as a growth environment, that's really a pretty hostile environment. And yet hydrilla's got all the mechanisms it needs to basically create that environment and then tolerate it. And I think that's really interesting in that, if you would actually, when we've done the water quality measurements in the canopy, we would say, boy, that's not real conducive to plant growth, and yet hydrilla does quite well in those very conditions that it creates. Tuber production, and again, I did my dissertation on tubers, so that shows you what an exciting life I lead. But it's triggered. I think the neat thing about tuber production is it's triggered by a very slight change in day length, and that basically come September 21, you're going to see the plant. This was going to be a shoot that was going to shoot up in the water and grow up to the canopy, like I told you. What happens on September 21 when day length goes to 12 is that shoot hooks and starts to grow straight down into the sediment. So all it is just a shoot growing down, and then it forms a tuber at the end. And that's basically where these tubers come from. And in terms of preferred food for like a ringneck duck, no doubt we've watched them just go in these hydrilla beds, pull the plant up, and get those tubers off. So I listened to Steve's talk and did a little bit of math here. And if you think of each tuber having about 1.2 calories per tuber, so a ringneck duck would have to consume 233 per day, which I think is pretty feasible. So one bird in 100 days would be 23,000. 1,000 birds would be 23 million in 100 days. But you got to remember, each acre can produce about 2 to 4 million. So even 1,000 birds could be supported on not that many acres if they were able to find every tuber, which is probably not likely. But just doing the math, it does add up pretty nice. And certainly, like I said, from a ringneck duck standpoint, that's what they're after, is that tuber. I think the coots are feeding more on the vegetation, and they will find the tubers that have been pulled up. Now again, once the tuber becomes detached, and that happens in about 40 days after formation. So here you see a plant forming tubers. These are basically loading at the end of the tip, and then they'll detach at about 40 days. I don't think the waterfowler are finding those very efficiently. Based on our own sampling, that would be the most energetic experience ever for a bird, would be to actually dig through sediment and try to find tubers, because we're pulling hundreds of cores to do this, and I can tell you from an energetic standpoint, it's not real. I couldn't feed myself doing that. And then, again, the neat thing is these things can stay dormant in the sediment for years, and that's what makes Hydrilla such a difficult plant to control, is that you can get all the top growth and do a great job with it, and if you've got 4 million of these down there and it's asynchronous sprouting, they don't sprout at any given time. Basically, they'll sprout in January or they'll sprout in June, and there's always about 2% of the population sprouting at any given time. So it's a really neat strategy from a life cycle standpoint to me, is that you're only putting up 2% of your storage propagules. So if you've got high dark water, those aren't going to survive. But a year later, you're still putting up 2%, and if the water clarifies and you've got a decent tuber bank, those are the ones that will survive. So it really has been, from a looking at tubers and saying, is there a weak point in the life cycle? There really isn't. It just is a really great strategy for a weed to have, to put down that many propagules, and then they basically persist for years on end. Okay, so how many people have heard this? Hydrilla grows an inch a day. Yeah, several people. And, I started thinking about that at some point and saying, it's got to grow more than an inch a day, there's been 40 years of research on it, and so I said, well, let's just measure it. I mean, that's the easiest thing to do. It's not hard to measure, an inch a day. So we measured, we planted the plant and let it grow for 35 days in July, and essentially, at the end of 35 days, we had 3,200 inches of growth. So that was way beyond an inch a day. And by the 5th week, you're at 191 inches a day, okay? Now, I'm not saying that the individual plant is growing that much. What happens is the plant starts to branch prolifically. So what's happening is it's producing lateral stems, new stems, runners. We think linear. We're thinking, how quick does it grow to the surface? The plant is actually growing radially. And I think that's the really key thing, is when it's under a log form of growth, it's, again, this is an individual stem doing this. And then you got to basically take something like that and say, how would it do it with multiple shoots going on? Now, what I just showed you, that was basically optimal conditions, okay? You know, July growth, that type of thing. So if you know, we've basically taken the study and expanded on that and said, well, how does it grow through the year? And if you look at, and this is Gainesville, Florida, so it's not going to be pertinent to all of Florida, but you know, somewhat, really low growth from January to March, but it is growth. Okay, see, you're still down at, you know, 400 or 500 centimeters over a 35-day period. So it is expanding, okay? You know, every day of the year it's expanding a little bit. But what we've really noticed is this time period right around June or July when you go from growth to hypergrowth, okay? So Dr. Haller's told me on numerous occasions, he said, so you're telling me that plants grow faster in the summer. And I'm telling you plants grow faster in the summer, but I'm telling you that's hard to explain when you really look at temperature differentials and day length differentials. When it gets into that phase of growth, and right now we're up here in terms of growth, that there's something else going on. And as a manager, that's a real, you know, we get a lot of pressure sometimes. Hey, the hydrilla is getting bad, go out and manage it. And I'm trying to tell our managers, boy, July and August is like the absolute, aside from dissolved oxygen concerns, you're just, you know, you're pushing a rope. When you've got that fast a growth going on, it's really difficult to get on top of it. You know, you better kill every stick that's out there, because if you leave just a little bit at that growth rate, it's going to be right back. So when we see a scene like this, and this is probably one that's more pertinent to fishermen than duck hunters, but this was Lake Harris, and you see all those little circles, that's the radial growth I'm telling you about. That starts from a few shoots, and it's just expanding radially, and as each one expands radially, it doesn't take them that long to grow together. So when we have biologists go out and say they didn't see plants in June and now in July they've gotten really thick, I used to think it was bad survey technique, and I'm convinced now it really does grow that fast in the summer. And you know, that summer growth is, you know, when does it put on all of its weight? I think it's really occurring in a pretty short period of time. And then from that period on, we're just perceiving cover. You're talking about replacement growth and that type of thing, but you know, how long does it take to get to a canopy? It's really not very long. Now, you know, having been out on the lakes and done a lot of you know, sampling and that type of thing, I used to think when people said the coots were having a big impact on the hydrilla biomass that they were crazy, that you know, you couldn't have enough. I'm a believer now after watching those things. They can really, you know, because the plant growth rate is so slow, and you put thousands of birds on those plants day after day, they do start to take their toll. So, you know, from a biomass standpoint, you know, we've seen that they really can, you know, at least knock down the biomass through the early part of the spring, and then, you know, basically we're coming back from root crowns and tubers and that type of thing. But you know, on any of the big Kissimmee chain lakes, when we see open water coots, I mean, all you got to do is run out there, and there's hydrilla down there, and you know, that's 99% of the time that's what you're going to find. So you know, I've told you all the great things hydrilla can do. You know, it's certainly like any plant, it's got constraints, and it's like any submerged aquatic plant. Its biggest constraint is light. It's got to have adequate light, and so again, bringing up a situation like the Harris chain. And that whole theory of alternate stable states. The Harris chain is either going to grow algae or it's going to grow plants. And you know, right now it's more based, you know, more algae dominated, but all it takes is a slight clarification, and that gives the plants the advantage. And that's kind of the, you know, last year was a year when the plants had the advantage, and you saw several thousand acres pop up on the lake pretty quickly. And then, you know, my take on that is that once it would get established on that lake, then you don't have that alternate stable state. You've got, you know, the hydrilla is going to actually create conditions that tend to favor itself. Tannic water is a really good one. Dexter and Woodruff is, several years ago we had to do some treatments on Dexter and Woodruff, and the hydrillas just never come back from there. And that's largely because once the hydrilla was under control, you had tannic water coming down, and even those tubers that were sprouting are sprouting basically under complete dark, and they're just not going to survive. Now, it doesn't mean there's not still hydrilla out there. I can promise you there is. And the day that water clarifies a bit, you'll see hydrilla come back again. Herbivores, whether we've stocked grass carp or there's some generalist out there, some of the snails that will eat hydrilla pretty well. Water quality, we're never going to see hydrilla just take off in an area like the Ocala forest. It's just the water quality is just not right. It's too, low alkalinity, low nutrient conditions. Sediment quality and nutrition can really drive, where hydrilla will or will not grow. And then, we like to think as managers, consistent management is one of the drivers in terms of us setting the clock back on hydrilla and trying to keep it under control in the lakes where it really will take off. Hydrilla, and this is really the only part that I'm going to talk about management. But we used to have a herbicide called fluridone, and I think aside from bass fishermen, duck hunters might have been the only group that hated fluridone more. And fluridone was a very effective herbicide and could be used at a large scale to take out hydrilla. And I think one of the neat things about hydrilla as a plant was it remains the only clonal, and again, it's an all-female population, it's the only clonal plant that's ever developed a true resistance to a herbicide. So we have a situation in the late 90s, early 2000s where fluridone just stopped working. And the plant basically came up with a physiological mechanism to deal with fluridone. And what I find really interesting about that is if you think about it, that one or two plants that was actually tolerant to fluridone basically reinvaded all of these lakes. So we not only had one introduction and invasion, if you really think of this plant as being novel, which it is, it came back in. So in our Kissimmee chain, Istapogas, Polk County, any of those big lakes that had been treated for years, basically all of those lakes now are fluridone tolerant. And that was basically a reinvasion of hydrilla. So, does tend to make you understand the plant's got some real potential for growth. So why did it matter? From a manager's standpoint, it mattered a lot. Because we used to allow hydrilla, kind of the term that we used was boom and bust. You didn't panic when you saw hydrilla taking off because you knew you had a tool that you could use very cost effectively. Even if the whole lake was socked in, you had a cost-effective tool to control hydrilla. And when we lost that tool, we lost that ability. So that whole idea of being able to go out and manage hydrilla for boom and bust went away. And we were essentially left with a contact herbicide that was 60 years old that we had to basically reinvent to be able to use on a large scale. And then it's just significantly more expensive. When we lost fluridone, we lost cost-effective hydrilla control with herbicides. Abundance is one of the things we tend to, pretty easy to tell if a lake's covered over. A little bit harder when we start talking about this ideal. The bass fishermen tell us 30%. And I tell them, why not 31? I think that would be better. But it's really hard. I mean, if looking at the growth curves that I showed you, trying to maintain 30% of something that grows that fast is really hard. And boy, we'll find 30%, but it's usually on our way to something much greater. And that's kind of the problem that we've run into with hydrilla. And then this whole issue of what is 30%? Is it just coverage, or does it have to be on the surface? Do you want it spotty? Do you want it all in one portion of the lake? I mean, it really gets a little bit complex if you start thinking about it on these big lakes. So from an expansion standpoint, what we've tried to say as managers is that initial establishment is the difficult step. If we can prevent it from going from 2 to 10%, we really feel like as managers we can stay on top of it. Once we get to 30%, it really is hard to keep on top of. It's unpredictable, I'll put it that way. It doesn't mean that it's always going to expand rapidly, but it's proven that it certainly can. So there's been a very common narrative, and I've used it more than anybody, is that, boy, you can go from 30 to 70% in 2 months. But I just didn't, we didn't have any data to show that. And I've often said, hydrilla creates good conditions for growing more hydrilla, meaning that as the hydrilla expands, you clarify the water, you stabilize sediments, you do all of those things that create clearer water that allow even further expansion. And again, think we basically wanted to go out and show that. So I want to show you Goblet's Cove on Lake Toho. And we came into May 2011 with 36% cover. Okay, this is based on point intercept data, 36% cover. That's right where you want to be if you're, you're talking to fishermen, that type of thing. By June, so essentially 1 month later, we were at 70% cover. Okay, so the plant's on the march. And this is about a 750 acre area. And by July, we're at 93% cover. So I mean, that area socked in pretty quickly. And by August, this wasn't just cover, this was dense hydrilla cover, meaning that it was either on or very near the surface. We were at about 70 or 80%. So basically being able to monitor that, I feel a little better about saying, yes, I mean, if you let it get to 30, I can't promise you it's going to grow like this, but it certainly has much better potential to grow like that. And this year we're monitoring it in a little bit different way with some different mapping techniques. But this was an interesting one. This was Goblet's Cove with the reds showing high density cover and yellows being there but lower in the water column. This was a May 16th treatment that was done. Created some nice open water, but by July we're starting to see it fill back in, and I've got a guy on the lake right now doing the mapping, and my guess is we'll be right back here. So even with management, hydrilla during the summertime, it can just grow right back in. So if we think of hydrilla, then and now, and these are lakes that I selected, so I'm sure you guys could select your own lakes and make a counter argument to me, but I just wanted to show that some of our larger lakes did have a history of growing. You look at Istapoga, had 25,000 acres at one point of hydrilla back in '96. Where are we today? Right around 8,000, okay? And that's with extensive ongoing management, and that's also with a lot of give and take between waterfowlers, fishermen, plant managers, really trying to decide what's the best way to move forward on these lakes. West Lake Toho, kind of the similar condition, even with extensive management. And then we have these oddballs like Weo. Lake Weo, Walking Water, had basically solid hydrilla. And the hurricanes after '04, it has just never come back, and it's just a mystery. You can't find tubers out there, and hydrilla just won't grow. So I mean, there are sites where, go figure, I couldn't tell you why. I'll talk about Hatch in a minute. Orange Lake, I'd say about 4,000 acres of dog fennel right now. It's amazing. I mean, we lost our lake. and then some of these others, so I don't want to belabor that. But here's one where I can say, it's been a bone of contention between managers and waterfowlers, and not trying to dodge any issues here. I am as big a proponent as anybody of saying we need to manage this arm of Lake Hatch-Naha, because that's where the hydrilla is getting established, and it basically represents the threat to the rest of the lake. And the reason is, going back here, Hatch-Naha at one point had 90% hydrilla. We know it can grow there. We know that whole lake can fill in. And so from the standpoint of management, if we know this is likely to be the source, as managers, we really want to keep that at as low a level as possible. And, we've had many waterfowlers say you're killing the only good habitat available on that lake. So not always right and wrong or clear issues, but it's a tough issue. I'm not going to back down as a manager, and say, I think, yeah, we ought to let it grow there, but, I also understand your point of view that may be the only available habitat on the lake where, hydrilla would grow dense enough to attract ducks. Kind of what we've gotten to in management is you take a lake like Istapoga, and here's again, 25,000 acre lake, and here's kind of a density of hydrilla and other SAV. And we end up anymore with a lot of kind of patchwork type management. This is based on a lot of input and that type of thing. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's a big change from the past where you could go in with a fluoridone and manage the whole lake. And so it's become more complex is the bottom line. And I would say that we don't always have real strong agreement between fisheries and waterfowlers. Fisheries want us to go in and manage these littoral areas and get the hydrilla out of the native emergence. Waterfowlers again are saying, man, leave it there. That's where the birds are using it. So Management options are limited. You know, I wish I could tell you there were great things on the horizon, but there aren't. I didn't mean to leave out the picture of grass carp, but well, there he is. Okay, so, you know, just few options is the bottom line. And do nothing is an option. We can always do nothing. And, you know, that gets to be problematic. I know a lot of people here are interested in the STAs. I've talked to several of the managers down there. And this is an interesting one to me because you've got 20,000 acres of SAV down there. Most of it being Naiad and Cara, and I believe Steve mentioned, you know, what a great waterfowl resource both of those plants are. You've got 5,000 acres of Hydrilla, and there's a couple things that stand out to me. Why doesn't Hydrilla dominate in the STAs? I've told you all these wonderful things that it does. It's gotten into the STAs, but it's never really just dominated. And it really gets back to the fact that you're talking about 2 feet of water. Hydrilla loses almost every competitive advantage it has when you get into 2 feet of water. You know, what's the you know, a canopy in 2 feet of water is nothing. So, and it's really not preferred according to the biologists there. Well, it's not a preferred plant in the STAs from a function standpoint because it's prone to crashes. Whereas the Naiad and the others stay intact pretty well. The Hydrilla will boom and bust in those systems. The STAs and waterfowl, I think a higher diversity of waterfowl is probably one of the reasons that there's no strong preference for the Hydrilla. But, you know, according to them, they just don't see a lot of, you know, birds concentrated in the Hydrilla only. I thought this was neat. This is them moving native plants around with a helicopter. They just take Naiad and get all the seeds and just spread it all over the STAs. And that's, you know, at least novel, if nothing else. Comments we've gotten, Hydrilla at its worst is not that bad. You know, it's just an aesthetic issue. Leave it alone. Management's ultimately necessary, but habitat value is more important. You know, I always counter with, you know, when is it necessary and who decides? And then Hydrilla management is simply a matter of money. Yeah, well, it can be lots of money. And, you know, you let it continue to spread, it can be a lot more than that. I'm going to finish with a couple of issues here. How many people have heard of the AVM issues on, you know, some of the northern lakes? You know, a pretty significant issue going on up there. This is Strom-Thurmond. Hydrilla's basically come in and then basically grown throughout all the coves in the entire reservoir there. That's about, I forget how big Strom-Thurmond is, but it's in the, you know, 40, 50,000 acre range. Algae grows on the surface of the leaf. It's called a stignemathalin algae. It produces a toxin. Coots feed on it. It causes them to be neurologically impaired, and then they're preyed on by eagles and other raptors, and that's caused several eagle deaths on Strom-Thurmond, and a pretty significant issue up there for sure. And the reason it's becoming more relevant here is that, you know, we did have the group from the University of Georgia at least survey pretty extensively on Lake Toho, and we can find now the stignemathalin algae, you know, throughout Lake Toho. Now, it does not mean that we have AVM on Lake Toho, and it doesn't mean that that algae is producing toxin on Lake Toho, but it does mean that it's there, and potentially it could, and it's something to be concerned about. So if you do see coots or ringnecks that look impaired, you know, I'd probably get with your waterfowl biologist, because that is, you know, it's a pretty characteristic symptom when they start circling and they can't fly right, that type of thing. So it is of concern. I hate to talk about this one because snail kites have dominated my professional life here for years, but, you know, the issue of the snail kite and the invasive apple snail on Toho, that's certainly changed our management on there, and probably, at least from a duck hunter's perspective, to the positive. You know, less management and more attraction of waterfowl. I'm going to finish up with what's down the road. You know, what are the new things coming? We don't have any new technologies coming, but we have new plants, and, you know, that's not a good thing. Giant salvinia, talk to any of the waterfowlers in Louisiana, and they'll tell you probably not a good thing. You know, and we don't want it in Florida at all. Crested floating heart on the Santee Cooper chain, several thousand acres and growing. That's one that we're real concerned about. And how many have seen the Ludwigia on the Kissimmee chain? And, well, I'll tell you, that really concerns me, because basically what you see happening is all of these grass islands on the Kissimmee chain, to me, look really susceptible to this plant. The Ludwigia gets intertwined in them, and basically just dominates them. And it's almost functioning as a floating plant. It's not got a taproot in, it just is growing on these grass beds. And to me, that's just pretty clear habitat loss, where you've got a nice kind of open habitat and you're going to something so dense we can't put an airboat through it. And if you read the European literature, waterfowlers do not like Ludwigia one bit, and you know, from at least this form of Ludwigia. So 60 years of hydrilla in Florida. You know, we called it Florida Eladia and watched it spread. From 70 to 85, we did a lot of research on the biology and control, had some grass carp wars, and I guess the grass carp lost. 86 to 2000, large lake expansion, saw a lot of fluoridone use. 2000 to 2009, fluoridone resistance, hurricanes, you name it. We had all kinds of plagues going on. DEP to FWC was a big change, and you know, I know a lot of people see that as a real positive. And I'm being facetious here, but you know, we're in a new decade, and you know, it is cheap and easy habitat. You know, you can ask the Chinese, so they'll tell you. But it's a difficult issue. I don't mean to make light of it, and you know, I know managers and waterfowlers hopefully will continue to work together and try to figure out, you know, where we should and maybe, you know, should manage, and maybe where we need to leave it alone. And with that, I think I probably ran long, Jamie, but okay, I appreciate everyone's attention. Thank you.